Okay, so thank you very much, Mark and Richard. Maybe I asked the wrong question. Right? The question I asked is, what does reconciliation look like? And maybe the appropriate question is, what does reconciliation feel like? And so I think reconciliation feels like home. I think it has to feel like home. A sense of connection, right, as well, to begin to talk to Richard's question as well. And I'm not sure that Duncan Campbell Scott would have been able to answer the question, what does reconciliation look like, or what does it feel like, right, as well. And in the middle of the night, I had this dream about Duncan Campbell Scott, who talked about the Indian problem, right? His famous speech, right, and the Standing Committee on Affairs talks about the Indian problem. And at the heart of Canadian public policy is the Indian problem. And so I said, Aboriginal politicians are trying to solve the Canada problem. Aboriginal people are trying to find a way to live with and live within this new entity that has built up around them, that has taken away their home. It sounds like a silence after a lecture. Any questions?
Okay, I'll say something. 6 years ago now, I think it was, Stephen Harper issued an apology on behalf of all Canadians for what went on in the residential schools. And I think the hope was in Ottawa, probably not just in the Conservative Party, though maybe especially in the Conservative Party, the hope was that this would be the end of a road, that there had been these Aboriginal people who'd been complaining and you know, talking for years, and now the government would apologize and that would be it. It'll all be over and done with it. We said we're sorry, we can move on. And as so often when these things happen, there are different understandings. That may have been the understanding in the Prime Minister's office, but I think for many other Canadians, especially, but not only Aboriginal people, the apology was meant to be the start of a process, a new process, and that process would involve a search for justice. For me, the idea of reconciliation is tied up with the sense of justice, because the peoples to whom great injustices were done in the past, these people are still here, still on their territory and in cities. And so the reconciliation, for me, involves understanding the injustices and moving towards a new sense of justice where and I found it very moving when Richard was talking about his sense of Canada, because I was very careful in my book not to spend too much time using the word we. I find it's very easy to, for me as a writer, to put on the royal we, and sometimes when people from the mainstream, as I am, use the word we in newspapers or on radio or television or whatever, what that we tends to mean is we white Canadians, or we mainstream Canadians, or we not Aboriginal Canadians. And so somehow what I would hope for in 20, 50, 100 years would be that this country would have reached a point where we would have got past the injustice to the extent that I could use the word we, and it would include Aboriginal Canadians as well as my people.
I like the fact that you went back to the apology in the House of Commons, because it really resonated with me that day watching it in my living room, and as a journalist for a number of years, always imagining what it would sound like to hear those words come out of the leader of the country's mouth. And there I was hearing these words that were profoundly sorry. And as time went by, I realized that it wasn't so much an apology as an utterance. Because as First Nations people, we're taught that the nature of an apology means that you've spent sufficient time looking at yourself and inside yourself and finding out the reasons why that apology was necessary in the first place. To find the defects in your thinking, the defects in your behavior, the defects in your sense of feeling that made that apology necessary. And then taking the steps with yourself to change those behaviors, to change those thoughts, to change those inclinations, so that you begin to act the opposite.
Hear, hear.
And that's an apology. And if and when you can do that, then the face of reconciliation becomes the face of the people that you offer that apology to. It becomes their face because they can hear your words and then they can watch you become different. They can watch you act different. So that apology that day wasn't that, because since that time the same things have continued. And we find ourselves 6 years later still facing the same type of thing, maybe even to a degree worse. So I think, and this is only my thoughts, I think that rather than the royal we in the English language, I think we need, when we're talking about reconciliation, we need to look at the royal re. Reconciliate, resolve, return. The R-E in the English language means, in an Aboriginal spiritual sense, that the re-solution means the solution always already existed, that it was given to us as human beings to be able to solve. And we come to it with intention and we become able to resolve that problem. The idea of conciliation, of being conciliatory, to work together to the solution of a common problem, is already there. We just need to be reminded of that, and then we can reconciliate. If we can do that, then you're right, in 20, 25, 30 years, the face of our country will be significantly different if we are reminded about that one fact.
So we also have opportunities for questions. This is intended to be a dialogue and discussion. And when politicians say that we're going to work towards a new relationship with Aboriginal peoples, I think, well, maybe we should start at building one in the first place. Because equality was never part of the equation. But it needs to be now. And we need to remember that regardless of what history says, or whatever slant in history that you subscribe to, whatever they say, this country was built by all of us. Aboriginal people played a very significant and vital part in the development and the opening up of this country. And yet in those history books, which are taught in schools and they're taught in curricula everywhere, we all know the name of Samuel de Champlain, we all know the names of Radisson and Groseilliers, but we don't know the names of the brown guys who were in the canoe. I found it very funny this afternoon when one of the lines on the information at the petroglyph site had a picture of the white guy in 1947 who was said to have discovered the petroglyphs. And I thought, well, there was a whole millennia and generation after generation of brown people who knew they were there. And those are significant facts that are missing from our history books. And we need to know the names of the brown people who were responsible for the development of this country. And if we can do that, then we understand that it was an equal partnership. It was equal effort that went into the development of this country. And if we can find that grain of equality, then we can look at the notion of relationship and reframe it in a way that includes everybody. So as you were saying earlier, it becomes we, and not just them and not just us. It becomes we because we step out and into those pages of books, and our children get the chance to read our history at the same time they read the history of Radisson and Groseilliers and all of those other guys.
As always, it seems I agree with every word Richard just said, which I hope isn't boring for you. Sometimes it's, it's interesting for an audience when panelists clash with each other, but I'm just wishing I'd said that. The first is, I think it's incumbent on those of us with power to make sure that we listen. One of the things I surprised Duncan Campbell Scott, surprised the Ghost by saying is that now, thank goodness, there are Aboriginal writers, there are Aboriginal musicians, there are filmmakers, there are artists, there are a good number now of really good books to read by Aboriginal authors, not only this guy. And that's something that's significant, and that's something that was not the case perhaps 20, 30, 40 years ago. I pull out a $20 bill in the last chapter of my book, and I show it to Duncan Campbell Scott. Not the new plasticized $20 bill that has the war memorial, but the Bill Reid canoe where Eagle and Raven are paddling together. I thought it was beautiful that that was on our money until the apologetic Prime Minister decided otherwise. And the second thing I want to say, which is coming from a very different angle entirely, is this. I just came back from a wonderful holiday in a place I'd never been before, which was the Orkney Islands off the north coast of Scotland. And the Orkneys, they're an incredible place. I could bore you by talking about them endlessly, but one of the interesting things about them for me as a Canadian was that this is the place where the Hudson Bay Company ships departed from. And there was one time, a couple of hundred years ago, when about 2/3 of all the Hudson Bay Company employees were from the Orkneys. John Ray, who discovered the fate of the Franklin expedition, was an Orkneyman and was then pilloried by the English as a result for revealing the truth of what the Franklin expedition resorted to cannibalism. And John Ray has a memorial in the cathedral in Orkney. And the great thing for me to discover was that the Orkney people are aware of and proud of and interested in the relations with the Aboriginal people of Canada, especially Northern and Western Canada. I bought a booklet when I was there, written by an Orkney woman, and it was about her discovery, thanks to Google ultimately, of her relations at the Sturgeon Lake Band in central Saskatchewan. Her great, I'm not sure how many times great-grandfather had gone over to Saskatchewan, well, it was now Saskatchewan, and had a family with a Cree woman, and they, the people in Sturgeon Lake were aware of this ancestry and interested in it. And in terms of reconciliation, the people in the Orkneys invited the people from Sturgeon Lake to come over. There was drumming, there was dancing, there was a tobacco ceremony, and this was welcomed by the Orcadians. And then a couple of years later, a delegation from Orkney went over to Sturgeon Lake, and there was a meeting of the two peoples. And I thought that was very beautiful for me, especially having grown up not far from Sturgeon Lake, to discover. And it made me a little sad that that kind of relationship isn't something that happens more often with mainstream people in this country.
I'm a member of a First Nation tribal group whose people have been here forever and ever. My story includes residential schools. My family went to residential schools, and I'm one of the intergenerational survivors of that legacy. My life became ripped apart from there by the intervention of social service agencies, and I was taken away from my family in what's become known as the 60s Scoop, another wonderful program, wherein Aboriginal children were literally scooped up and out of their communities and territories and transplanted into non-native homes, thousands and sometimes countries wide away from where they grew up. And so those two stories are galaxies apart in terms of similarities. But in our day-by-day life, we share those histories. We share the story of how we came to be the people that we are, at the ages that we are. And every time she tells me more about where she came from and what she endured, I get to become stronger because I understand her more fully, and I have empathy and I have compassion. And every time I share with her something about my story, she has the same reaction. She gets to become stronger. So in that relationship between a non-native woman and a native person is a microcosm of what we're talking about when we're talking about reconciliation. When we can listen to each other's story with an open heart and an open mind, we get to become empathetic and compassionate. We get to become stronger. Our hearts get stronger by the nature of that story that we're become willing to hear. So if we can do it, as a transplanted ex-communist living Hungarian woman, ex-residential school intergenerational trauma surviving Ojibwe person, then let that microcosm be indicative of what we can achieve as a country.
The question was, where does the current Indian Reserve System fit in, and the Indian Act fit in the reconciliation movement?
I'd like to read a paragraph from my book, if I can find it, because it's the only paragraph where I quote a guy called Richard Wagamese. Well, I think it's a pretty good paragraph to say. So,
I can't wait.
all right. Yet as the decades passed, more and more people in the cities of southern Canada began to see these reserves as backward remnants of a bygone age. Who in their right mind would want to live in Attawapiskat if they could move to Toronto or even Sudbury? Such a question usually leads to another. And why should we pay for them anyway? There are no economic reasons for Attawapiskat to exist, wrote a columnist in the National Post in 2011, and it does so only because it is underwritten by the Canadian taxpayer. He condemned the reserve's leaders for financial mismanagement, but added, the real killer is remoteness. The best short response I found is an article by the novelist and journalist Richard Wagamese, who was born in northwestern Ontario on what is now the Ojibwe Wagasimoon First Nation. When you're down to the last thing that represents a connection to who you are, Wagamese writes, when you've watched everything that was part and parcel of the story of your people get torn away, and you're left to stand with only one thing to hold on to, you will cling to that last thing with everything you have in order to not disappear. Any human being would. That's why Native people won't leave reserves despite the dire circumstances, because they're the last thing they have. Outsiders often look on such places as isolated enclaves, cut off from the modern world, disconnected from everything that matters. To Wagamese, that view is radically mistaken. In the minds of many Aboriginal people, their reserves, quote, represent the tie to cultural ways, traditional teachings, spirituality, language, history, worldview, and self-identity. They are roots, and they are a reminder that a people's sovereignty was never and is not for sale, barter, or surrender.
David.
We often deal with this question as well in the Indigenous Studies class, right, as well. It is a very difficult question to answer. I don't know whether anyone has a good solution. And Indian reserves were originally what I call holding pens for Indians. And they were established, right, to move us out of civilized areas, to use the term, okay, at the time, right? And we were placed there either to end our days because we were deemed to be disappearing, so this was a humane way, right? Or they were sites where the state could attempt its transformation. Right? Agricultural schools were established, right? Other things were undertaken. But over time, right, as Richard has said, right, they became symbols and they became the last bits of land that people had control over. And they right, are now a part, right, of our lives. And so Right? Even those of us who don't live on reserves still see them as home. Right? And so they're very challenging public policy issue. Right?